You notice it at checkout, not check-in, a thin extra line on the hotel bill called a city fee. It is a few dollars a night, easy to ignore. But in a lot of places, that quiet charge now fills holes that used to be covered by healthier tax receipts. Towns lean on it the way families lean on a side gig, useful, but not the plan. When a city adds these little add-ons, or trims library hours, or delays street repairs by one more quarter, it is telling you something simple. The cushion got thinner. Here is the scale of that cushion. At the end of fiscal year 2025, the median state could run government operations for 46.9 days using only its rainy day fund, down from 53.2 days the year before, according to estimates collected by the National Association of State Budget Officers and analyzed by Pew, published October 15, 2025. In plain language, if a downturn or disaster hits, the average state now has about a week less breathing room than it had last year. The pressure comes not only from emergencies, but from softer revenue. Urban Institute's State Tax and Economic Review finds that, after inflation, state sales taxes fell in late 2024 and continued to slip into the first half of fiscal 2025, while corporate income taxes dropped even more. That means everyday transactions and business profits, the workhorses of many state budgets, brought in less real money. For a resident, this shows up as slower sidewalk fixes, fewer buses at off-peak times, and temporary hiring freezes that quietly become permanent. None of this is dramatic on its own. A hotel surcharge here, a shorter pool season there, another grant cycle postponed. But taken together, these small adjustments reveal a pattern. Leaders are buying time while revenues wobble and fixed costs climb. The numbers above appear only once in this story, yet they keep echoing in the decisions you see on your block. That hotel line item is not about tourism alone. It is a signal that the budget math no longer balances on last decade's assumptions. If the cushion is thinner and the receipts weaker, what changed between the flush years and now? The next step is to compare then versus now, how states went from record surpluses to tighter margins, and which kinds of states feel it first. A few years ago, it felt like states had finally caught a break. Federal relief was flowing, markets were strong, and budgets that had been patched together for decades suddenly showed black ink. According to the National Association of State Budget Officers, state rainy day funds reached a historic peak in fiscal 2022, a level that meant many governments could cover weeks of operations without new taxes or sudden cuts. NASBO, January 25, 2023. For an ordinary household, that was the equivalent of having a real emergency fund for the first time in a long while. Money that could keep the lights on if something went wrong. That moment did not last. As temporary federal aid faded and investment gains cooled, growth in those cushions slowed sharply. Pew's later reviews show that by the end of 2024, state tax collections had slipped below their long-term inflation-adjusted trend after having stood well above it just 2 years earlier. In everyday terms, states moved from surprise bonuses back to paychecks that come in a little lighter than expected, while their monthly bills kept climbing. The story quietly turned from how to use extra money to how to stretch what is left. You can see the contrast clearly in places built on visitors. Nevada's own industry report for 2024 notes that tourism-related activity supplied over a third of its general fund revenue, keeping other taxes relatively low for residents. When travel softens or gamblers spend less freely, that dependence turns from strength to strain. A dip in room nights or casino play does not just hurt hotels. It leans directly on the state budget. 1 week season no longer disappears inside a comfortable surplus. Resource-heavy states live a different version of the same risk. Alaska's official forecasts show how a large share of its unrestricted general fund depends on petroleum prices and permanent fund earnings, which can swing with global markets and investment returns. For a family, that is like tying your mortgage payment to the stock market. Fine in the good years, unsettling once prices or dividends move the wrong way. The headline balance may still look solid, but the ground under it moves. Then there are the large, high-commitment states. California's nonpartisan fiscal office describes how recent budgets had to close a sizable shortfall while still promising full funding for schools, healthcare, and infrastructure, all built on revenues that depend heavily on top earners and capital gains. When markets cool or high-income taxpayers have a slower year, the gap between promises and income widens fast. Together, these examples mark a shift from the brief era of record cushions to a landscape where many states stand on narrower ledges, setting the stage for deeper cracks in how they raise money and what they are obliged to pay for. Beneath the surface of those thinner cushions sits a harder problem. The money coming in no longer moves in step with the bills that must go out. Pew reports that by the end of 2024, state tax revenue had dropped to 3.2%, below its 15-year trend, after standing far above that line just 2 years earlier, June 16, 2025. For you, that is like seeing your income fall below what used to be normal, while your mortgage, utilities, and prescriptions stay exactly the same. The gap is small on paper, but it is persistent, and it chips away at comfort. The sources of that income are also less steady. New analysis from Pew in March 2025 shows growing swings in both personal income and sales tax receipts across many states. Those are the workhorse taxes, tied to paychecks, shopping, and capital gains. When markets shift or households cut back a little, collections can lurch instead of glide. For governments that built plans on unusually strong years, this new volatility means they cannot be sure next spring will look anything like the last one. At the same time, key obligations do not flex as easily. Kaiser Family Foundation's 2025 overview notes that Medicaid alone accounts for nearly 1/5 of national health spending and takes a major share of state budgets, with officials expecting continued pressure from costs even as enrollment adjusts. A family can delay a vacation. A state cannot simply pause coverage for low-income seniors or people with disabilities. These commitments renew every day, regardless of how hotel stays or sales taxes performed last quarter. Retirement promises add another fixed layer. Urban Institute estimates that state and local pension plans together remain underfunded by at least $1.6 trillion, depending on assumptions, Backgrounder updated 2024. This figure represents benefits already earned by teachers, police officers, and other workers. When investment returns disappoint, states must either raise contributions, trim other services, or, in some cases, adjust benefits for future hires. It is a slow pressure, but it does not go away on its own. Put together, many governments are leaning on unstable income while locked into rising health and retirement costs and, in some cases, dependent on visitors and high-end spending that no longer feel guaranteed. This is less about a single crisis and more about an arrangement that leaves little room for error. In that setting, it takes only one softer year or one policy surprise to force quiet mid-year moves that most residents notice only after they are already in place. The first real signal rarely comes with a headline. It comes as a short notice taped to the door of a local office. Positions temporarily frozen. A planned repaving pushed to next construction season. A transit line that quietly switches from every 15 minutes to every 24. These are small adjustments, but they tell you that someone at the state capitol has already done the math and decided the numbers no longer feel comfortable. By early 2025, analysts at the Pew Charitable Trusts described this moment as an inflection point. More states debating shortfalls at once than at any time since the pandemic shocks, even though the national economy was still adding jobs and inflation had cooled. January 13, 2025. One example they highlighted was Maine, where the official outlook flipped from surplus to a projected structural gap of hundreds of millions of dollars in the next budget cycle. For a household, this is like realizing your paycheck will not cover regular bills a year from now, even if nothing goes wrong with the broader economy. It forces early choices. At the same time, new data from Pew in March 2025 showed that while many states still reported strong savings, a group already planned to draw on their rainy day funds to balance upcoming budgets. When leaders tap those accounts before a recession, they are not panicking. They are buying time. But every early withdrawal, even a modest one, turns that safety net into something thinner. Residents do not see the transfer on a statement the way they see a tax bill, yet they feel it later when there is less room to absorb the next shock. The immediate toolkit is familiar and quiet. Agencies leave vacancies unfilled instead of announcing layoffs. Maintenance is delayed rather than canceled. Grants to local governments are reprofiled into later years. In several states that ran into trouble ahead of others, Pew's review shows how lawmakers mixed targeted cuts, new fees, and one-off maneuvers instead of reversing earlier tax cuts or major programs. Each step looks manageable. Together, they mark the moment when easy money has gone and improvisation begins. What makes this phase important is timing. These moves are appearing not in the middle of a deep downturn, but while headline indicators still suggest stability. That mismatch, quiet restraint inside budgets, normal life on the surface, signals that the next stage will not be driven by panic, but by a slow chain of consequences. Weaker revenue in key sectors, shrinking cushions, and, finally, visible choices about which services stay and which give way. The chain becomes visible when quiet fixes turn into things you cannot miss. A senior center closes 2 days a week until funding stabilizes. A state park that used to be open year-round shuts its gates on weekdays. A community college cancels an evening nursing program that older students counted on. None of this feels like a crash. It feels like a slow narrowing of options for people who did nothing wrong. Behind those signs sits an unusual pattern. Pew reported in November 2024 that tax receipts in most states fell for the second year in a row outside of a national recession, something rare in modern records. That detail matters because it means budgets are not slipping due to a sudden collapse. They are softening while the broader economy still moves forward. When underlying growth cools but obligations do not, every cautious forecast, every trimmed project, is part of a protective shuffle rather than a temporary storm. Some numbers show how this pressure concentrates. NASBO's August 2025 update notes that while many states still came in close to plan, a few, including Iowa, saw general fund receipts drop notably from the prior year, driven by weaker income and corporate taxes. Budget Blog, August 5, 2025. For residents, that is not an abstract statistic. It means their state entered the year expecting one level of support for schools, roads, and clinics, and ended it with less. States in that position must either use savings, search for new charges, or accept that some services will thin out. Sector strains add another layer. BLS data show that employment in leisure and hospitality remained significantly below its pre-2020 level well into 2023, leaving gaps in wages and local taxes in destinations that depend on visitors. Places that built their budgets on that activity cannot easily replace it with a small fee or a single cut. The effect is concentrated. Hotel towns, entertainment hubs, and gateway cities feel a persistent drag, even while statewide averages look steady. Put these signals together, and a pattern emerges without any headline word like crisis. States with slipping revenues in sensitive sectors, early withdrawals or stalled growth in reserves, and heavy commitments to healthcare or pensions are nudged step by step toward harder decisions. The question is no longer whether pressures exist. It is which combinations of thin cushions, shaky income, and fixed promises leave some governments closer than others to the edge, where going broke means something very specific. When people say a state might go broke, they rarely mean bankruptcy court. They mean crossing a point where the next surprise, an early winter storm, a dip in visitors, a softer stock market, forces leaders to choose between cutting into everyday services or breaking promises made to workers and retirees. In that sense, insolvency is not a single event. It is the moment flexibility disappears. The pattern that brings a government to that edge is clear. First, limited savings, reserves that would last only a short spell if taxes fell. Second, unstable income, heavy dependence on tourists, energy royalties, or high-end earners whose fortunes swing from year to year. Third, large fixed obligations, health programs, pensions, and debt payments that cannot be trimmed quickly without real harm. Each of these alone is manageable. The danger sits where they overlap. Recent mapping of state reserves by the Pew Charitable Trusts in October 2025 shows how uneven that starting point has become. One state holds savings equal to more than 300 days of operations, while another reports virtually none. For a viewer, that single contrast explains the risk profile. In one place, a downturn means time to adjust. In the other, the same shock means immediate cuts, urgent fees, or rushed tax changes. The indicator is not about pride. It is about room to breathe. Credit markets have begun to react to this mix of thin cushions and rigid costs. When Maryland lost its long-standing top-tier bond rating from Moody's in 2025, the agency pointed directly to weaker growth, heavy fixed expenses, and exposure to federal decisions as reasons. The state will still pay its bills, but even a small downgrade can make future borrowing more expensive, leaving fewer dollars for schools, roads, and safety. That is what going broke looks like in a modern, wealthy state. Not missed payments tomorrow, but steadily more money diverted to interest and patches. For residents, the practical meaning is straightforward. A government that fits this risk profile will respond to the next strain with hiring freezes that last, deeper postponements of maintenance, tighter eligibility for programs, and emergency sessions built around one-time fixes. It will protect bondholders first, because it must, and ask communities to live with slower responses and narrower support. People feel the result long before anyone uses the word crisis. The quiet test ahead will not come from commentary, but from official numbers. The next rounds of comprehensive state financial reports, NASBO fiscal surveys, Pew stress analyses, and rating agency updates will show which states move further into the danger zone, where small cushions, unstable revenue, and large obligations sit on the same line. The open question, for anyone watching their own town's fees creep up and services pull back, is simple. When those documents arrive, will your state look safely prepared, or already too close to that edge to pretend it is just another tight year?